Okay.
You're listening to the voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice.
Greetings, my friends. Salutations. Welcome again to the Richard James Show. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be on the planet Earth. Have a program set up for you. I'm going to go through a history thing. We're going to go back in time and take a look at the riots that occurred after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, our history has been a long one and it's been a rocky one. We were there from the beginning of this nation. We helped to build this nation into what it is today. Yet we have been treated like slaves. As a matter of fact, we were thrown into slavery. So we're going to go back and review the riots. Now, people uplift the whole philosophy of nonviolent passive resistance. Well, if I have been treating you like dirt, if I had enslaved you, if I had threatened you, and I'd hung you, destroyed your family, raped your women, then I would want you to be positive and nonviolent also. You know, don't come back with that uh, uh, violent, angry attitude. But as a matter of fact, what happened was not organized, not put together. There were riots that exist, protesting the injustices and inequality that's embedded in this society. And by the way, before we really get into it, uh, there's a new book that's put out by Maria James Child. We want to put it up so you people will be aware of it. They had shared a book signing uh, uh, the other day, and I was there. Here it is. Here's the book. Maria James Child. Count each breath. Maria takes adversity and takes life's history and she puts it into verse and in poetry. This book deals with some of the medical problems and issues she's had to deal with, particularly trying to get uh, services to cure her problem, to deal with her problem. And sometimes women have a problem in being considered seriously for their medical illness. Okay, but here's the book. Uh, Count each blessing. Uh, you can buy it now. You can buy it on Amazon. Uh, Take a look at it. Thank you. All right, Maria James Chow. Moving right along, uh, we're going to take a look at this whole issue as we talked about the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Just to briefly talk about what happened with Dr. King, we don't really know. There was a James Earl Ray individual who was involved in the alleged assassination of Dr. King. Uh, he was probably put up to it, and when we don't know the circumstances, but anyway, Dr. King, at the tender age of 39 years old, was assassinated 1968. He lost his life. Uh, As a matter of fact, the day before he was assassinated, he had preached his own eulogy, his own funeral. He said, "We have been to the mountaintop and we've looked over the river Jordan and we have seen the promised land. Uh, but we may not get there uh, as a people. In other words, he may not get there as a person, but we as a people will get to the promised land." Well, we're still striving to do that. To think that we will have a society at some point without racism and prejudice, I think is as a pipe dream. I don't think that's going to happen. It may happen. It would be wonderful if it did happen. But considering the nature of the people that we're dealing with, I don't think so. We're in a situation now where things are getting more treacherous and more dangerous than they ever were in our society. Uh, Personally, I believe in approaching the whole issue problem of discrimination and inequality with love and equal opportunity for all. You can't, in one sense, destroy hate with hate. Uh, Hate is a two-edged sword. Individual that you're trying to cut, and it'll cut you. So yes, we need to take a look at this problem. One of the reactions that took place, and considering all the other things, understandable, was the race riots, and this was a violent reaction. We had a minor scuffle in the city of Harrisburg. A school teacher had been thrown out of a store and an attack, and people reacted actually to that, but we never saw the violence that took place in Detroit, New York, Washington D.C., and some of these other areas. We never really saw that, even though it occurred. Uh, Let me just read some things, uh, maybe some poetry. Hold on just a second, folks. Right. Mm. There's Behold, the King of Love is alive. We once shed tears for his departure. We wept openly and ignited 1,000 fires. City streets were paved with blood. Hope had left us, leaving only bitterness and despair. The king seed was planted deep into the American soil. Love sprouted like an eternal waterfall. Cities began to change leadership. Behold, the king of love is alive. The spirit of love has given rebirth to hope. Mankind faces challenges with added vigor, poverty, homelessness, drugs, and fear still exist. Yet love is a warrior for righteousness. Behold, my friends, the king of love is alive. Even though you have destroyed the body, lying, molding in the grave, the spirit of love is there. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No segregation, no segregation, no segregation, Lord, for me. Yes, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. I woke up this morning with my mind still on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind still on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind still on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Preaching and crying with my mind, stay on freedom. Preaching and crying with my mind, stay on freedom. I'm just a preaching and crying with my mind. Oh, Lord, he said, stay on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Yeah, we sang, we marched, we protested, and tried to lift up the philosophy of nonviolence and try to suppress the whole thing of hatred and bigotry and not become the biggest that our enemies are. We tried that. But when Martin Luther King was assassinated, it was just too much. He was the spokesman, he was the philosopher, he was the author of the whole system of love. He said nonviolence, protest. So you can stand up and believe in something and fight for something and realize that your enemy is your brother. And sometimes your brother is your enemy. In other words, you don't want to try to perpetuate the system, systemic system of hate and racism that live and exist in this society. So you try to do some positive things. Now, one of the cities that exploded after the death of Martin Luther King was Kansas City. Kansas City is a popular, well-known city, known for its music and whatever, and its culture and that kind of thing. Well, what happened was that it exploded. Riots broke out as a result of the assassination, terrible assassination of this great human being. So I got a little video that, that's up. It's not one that I created, but one that it exists. Take a look at it. And that'll give you some background on what happened in Kansas City. And then we're going to continue to explore this whole issue where hope lies. Where do we find hope? Let's take a look at it. Thank you.
With 41 Action News, we're at Lincoln College Prep, where the protests began 50 years ago.
And those protests would lead to riots that would claim 6 lives, 300 arrests, and multiple blocks of the city in flames.
Tonight, a special report on what happened.
And stay with us for a conversation with eyewitnesses, political leaders, historians, and with you.
And now, 68, the Kansas City race riots, then and now.
The line of mourners is endless. This is probably going to be quite simply the greatest funeral ceremony ever accorded a private person in the United States.
On this National Day of Mourning in memory of Dr. Martin Luther King, many Americans teeter on the edge of fear.
Due to mob action and civil disobedience, a state of emergency exists within the city of Kansas City, Missouri.
Here in the state capitol, Governor Warren Hern says he's ordering elements of the National Guard to Kansas City.
Fires are raging out of control in the area bounded by 36th and Prospect through 39th and Prospect.
The city's general hospital received victims of the violence throughout the night. 4 were dead on arrival. One of these was a 12-year-old boy.
That's 15 persons injured in shooting incidents, 75 fires, and nearly 200 businesses looted. That's part of the tally in the Kansas City civil disorder.
I seriously question the necessity of throwing tear gas where children are congregated. An investigation should be made.
68, Kansas City's race riots then and now, is a joint presentation of KCPT Public Television, 41 Action News, and the Kansas City Public Library.
It all started here. Hundreds of high school kids in Kansas City were heartbroken after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the school district's failure to give them space to grieve. What started as a student protest grew in size and intensity to the point that it forever changed this community. Give me 30 minutes. Let me tell you a story. The who, what, when, where, but most of all, the why. It may make you proud, and it may make you cry. But my hope is that it reminds us all of how far we've come and inspires us to come together the rest of the way.
NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
I was in this room 50 years ago, sitting somewhere near the north door, morning of the 9th of April, 1968.
Grace and Holy Trinity Church organized a special service honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. days after his assassination. There was a speaker.
A young lady walked up and handed him a note right here. He handed him a note, and he says, "Thank you. Is there a Mr. Alvin Brooks in the congregation?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You have an emergency call." It was Robert Wheeler, who was Assistant Superintendent of Urban Education for the Kansas City School District. And he said, "Al, as we predicted last night, all hell's broken loose."
District officials met the night before to discuss closing KCPS schools for Dr. King's funeral. The 3 African Americans voted to close the schools. Everyone else said they should stay open. Ultimately, the superintendent, James Hazlitt, stepped in.
Hazlitt decided, the superintendent decided, well, here's what we'll do. They just completed the school at 42nd in Indiana. Let's name it Martin Luther King Jr. High School, and then fly all the flags on all the school properties half-mast. That wasn't good enough for us, but it was good enough for them, and so that's why the schools were open.
On April 9th, 1968, students from Lincoln Prep, Manual, and Central started calling each other.
I mean, King got shot, and it was like, what? They'd killed Martin Luther King? Right. Here he was out there trying to do good, trying to do it peacefully, and for that to happen?
And Kansas City, Kansas had allowed its students to come out of school, and that troubled the kids in the Kansas City School District.
We're gonna walk out because the school is telling us to all stay in, and so we walked out.
The kids from Lincoln went first. Then the students from Manual. Hundreds of them all went to Central. And when they got there, the group merged together and headed to City Hall.
It looked to me, they say 300, it looked like me 1,000 people coming to northbound of the Paseo, and they were like sidewalk to sidewalk.
And the 17th Terrace and Paseo is where the mayor came out and spoke to them.
Mayor Ilis Davis told the students they could go to City Hall.
I think the butterflies went to my stomach all the way up, oh, shoot,
And the kids went up north through the I-70 and then walked west on the eastbound lane.
Bruce R. Watkins leading the way, fist raised in the air.
I remember that march. My dad was serving as mayor pro tem, first African-American city councilman, now serving mayor pro tem during the riots. So I can see him feel a personal responsibility, not only as a elected official, but as a person concerned.
Watkins was also the first African-American elected to county-wide office. 71 Highway is named after him. But on April 9th, 1968, he was grieving Martin Luther King's death too.
The most well-respected civil rights leader in this country, in the world, was just assassinated. The atmosphere, the mood of that time was still very on the edge.
It was already fuming. Even before his death, we were conscious of the fact that it was a separation of different colors.
1968 was also in the heart of the Black Power movement. African Americans were feeling newfound pride in their heritage. Everything from fashion to music to the raised fist became a symbol of solidarity and resistance in the face of discrimination. That symbol is still used today.
We were ensconced in that, and we were ready to fight on our end.
Bruce R. Watkins was too.
It's time for a change. It's time to march. It's time to do.
I felt like we were empowered to do something.
I was a city desk reporter at the Kansas City Star, and during that period of the march, there was no damage. The kids, no doubt, were angry, but they weren't causing any trouble. They were not breaking windows or anything like that.
The students made it to City Hall. At the same time, KMBC cameras recording as a police line was forming.
We all got in a semicircle, just a group of us. I mean, there was nobody there except a bunch of cops and highway patrolmen. And there was a black female walked in the line in front of us, and she was cursing us and yelling at us. And all of a sudden, I saw a soft drink bottle from behind her come flying over her and broke. And next thing I heard was click, click, click. That's the sound of a pin being pulled with a gas grenade, and the gas, boom. And I mean, it was all over because, you know, we had the gas masks and stuff.
A whole bunch of tear gas went out in that crowd, and I think it made the crowd very, very mad. And I think the riot started at that moment.
And that afternoon, evening, the burning started.
It was hurt that brought the kids here to the steps of City Hall. But once the tear gas cans started flying, smoke filling the air, burning their eyes and their skin, the protesters moved from hurt to angry.
Personally, this is my own personal opinion, I didn't see a need for that first gas can. I mean, it was a pop bottle. It was one single soft drink bottle. It wasn't even close to the officers.
As an officer, what was your feeling? Did you feel like this is the right call, this is the wrong call? Oh no.
It's a term you can't use on TV. I'll just say, oh, sucks.
KMBC cameras were rolling as school district and city leaders brought in buses to get the kids away from City Hall and calm things down.
Call Father Timothy Gibbon over at Holy Name Catholic Church at 23rd and Benton about opening the church for these kids, because that's where they had teen towns every weekend. And the police followed them out there on these buses. The kids were in there, the music was blasting and everything. And then, of course, the police were there, and they started taunting the police. And then police threw tear gas into the basement of the church.
Witnesses described screams coming from below as officers blocked the doors. Others say police didn't even know the dance was going on.
Those young people had been completely honorable, peaceful, organized, and caring all the way from 7 o'clock in the morning. When the tear gas began to hit people and they felt like it was being done for nothing, for no reason at all, then there was this sense of, I gotta do something. Once that happened and people fanned back out into the community, then all of a sudden it began to turn into fires and that the story of the riot began there.
At 3:21, the first shot is fired. At 4:17, the first Molotov cocktail is launched. By 5:20, Mayor Davis declared a state of emergency and imposed the first emergency curfew in Kansas City's history.
Is it pretty bad around? It's pretty bad. It's bad everywhere.
As day turned to night, reports of looting, vandalism, and arson took over the airwaves. KMBC cameras were there as fire alarms sounded every 2 minutes.
As the night went on, it became scary, because then the tanks are going down our neighborhood. It was a curfew.
It's gunshots, ma'am. Just stay inside.
State troopers had already been called in.
I heard a voice come out of the creek and said, go back into the house. It was the National Guard. They were camped down in Brush Creek.
Rioters attacked numerous white people and targeted white-owned businesses too.
Race relations were shattered, and the city faced a real challenge.
This wasn't unique. Starting in 1964, there were riots all across the country. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit. There were almost 160 riots in the summer of 1967 alone. All of them stemmed from rising racial tension.
68, there was real anger.
These images from Ferguson in 2014 look very similar to the ones taken decades before. People in one community who seem miles apart.
We think of us against them sometimes, And when I say them, I mean anybody who ain't the police is one of them, so to speak.
In the days that followed, 6 black men were killed during the rioting. Maynard Goh, Charles Martin, George McKinney, George McKinney Jr., Julius Hamilton, and Albert Miller. One with a case of whiskey in his hands, another with a hand in his pocket, 2 others just watching the fires, another following police orders.
None of them were armed. None of them had a confrontation with the police.
They were all shot by officers. No one ever charged in their deaths. Many in the black community feel scenarios like this are repeating themselves today.
The rumors were terrible. And there were people going around saying, oh man, them police going out and just shooting people on the street for no reason, just driving around and shooting them, you know, and I knew that wasn't happening.
But there was violence.
Kids laying on the ground. I said, hey, Bubba, what happened to him? He saw he cut his head on the glass when he came out of the building, split the head open. Okay, I said, wait a minute. He was already outside when I left, okay. He pulled his gun out and he said he cut up in this piece of glass. And I knew what he meant. He decked him. As I looked back at it, I said, oh, God, you know, we were worse than some of the people who we were trying to arrest, you know.
Today, police departments are grappling with the danger their officers face, working to protect those who protect us. At the same time, people are calling for fairness and enforcement when it comes to communities of color. What do you think now, 2018, would help relationships between the police department and the community?
I'm from the old school. Communicating with the community. I'd like to think that the officers we're getting now and the policies and the way this department's, you know, turned around, that sort of thing doesn't happen again.
It was an earth-shattering year, and the riots in Kansas City changed everything. 31st Street, which had a lot of African-American businesses, was essentially burned to the ground.
And the entire skyline of the city is lit up with flames. The worst seems to be from about 27th to 39th Street around Prospect, and every one of those blocks is a war zone.
I can recall being on my aunt's porch. She was at 32nd and Cleveland, just a block over from Mercington. And we stood on her porch in the dusk and we could see the fires on 31st Street.
First responders who came to help became targets for the rioters. KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
African Americans began to throw bottles and bricks at firefighters who came over to answer, you know, the fire bill to put out the fires.
I was a junior in high school. I lived on Montgall Avenue, 44th and Montgall, 1 block east of Prospect. Some buildings and some things were being burned a block away from where we lived.
Did it make any impact on you?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I still remember it, and I still remember the feeling.
When you look at the looting and the arson and the vandalism, people had specific reasons for why they targeted some businesses and why they didn't hit other businesses.
And then people started putting signs on their windows, Soul Brother, you know, to keep from getting burned down or looted or whatever.
Hundreds of businesses and buildings were destroyed. The property damage KMBC filmed would amount to almost $30 million today.
My mother kept telling us, why are we burning down our own things?
Well, because that's the only world they knew. To go west of truth was to die. And I think everybody realized that, if not consciously, certainly subconsciously.
Did we make a statement by getting out the rage? Yeah, but to burn down our own things didn't make any sense at that time.
So you see, again, from the perspective of somebody my age, those were not our things. Those were people who came into our neighborhood, did their business, and left at the end of the day. Right. So it didn't matter to us, you know.
The 1968 Mayor's Commission report, released a few months later, identified why the rioting happened. It lists things like inequities in the educational system, a lack of adequate job opportunities, long-standing difficulties with the police department, and housing problems and frustration with efforts to fix it.
This was a political statement. This was using violence to communicate in a way that nonviolence had been used in the South. Now, was it a good idea? No, not really, but it was articulate.
44 people were hurt in the riots. The area around 31st and Prospect has never returned to the thriving business community it once was.
Yeah, 50 years ago, and it doesn't seem that long.
You get the sense that the riot could happen just a couple of months ago. All of those issues that caused the riot are still there.
This community was far more vibrant decades ago. The 1970 U.S. Census shows just over half of African American headed households own their homes. But in the latest census in 2016, that number was down to just 37%. The number of African Americans in the city who are not in the workforce is up too, from 32% in 1970 to 36% in 2016. But unemployment overall has dropped from 12.6% in 1970 to 7.6% 2 years ago. Graduation rates paint an optimistic picture as well. At the college level, going from just 3% to 15%, and at the high school level, from 31% to 85%. Yet Kansas City public schools remain unaccredited. Finding quality, affordable housing is still a challenge, and the unemployment rate is still higher for African Americans than it is for white Kansas Cityans. What lessons can we learn from these riots 50 years ago? Why does it matter today?
The lessons that can be learned is that when you have disaffected people and you do not address their concerns over a period of time in a way that's constructive, you are going to have more riots. It's just that simple. When you have situations where people feel that they have no recourse and no hope, they'll take to the streets and start burning stuff up.
Once again, young people are taking the lead on a movement to enact change. On March 24th, thousands gathered at Tice Park for the March for Our Lives protest, pushing for gun reform. The local rally, organized in part by some of these Lincoln College prep seniors who staged a walkout of their own on March 14th. We wanted to know how they feel about their fellow alum walking out 50 years ago.
Impressed but not surprised.
Exactly. I feel like it's a Lincoln trait that we have. That's wild. Yeah, I feel like we could do that, but like knowing that they did that without any cell phones and like they organized that themselves, that's wild to me. That makes me really proud. Yeah, proud. Like knowing that these kids were our age and they're doing big things like that. And it started at our school. Yeah.
The major change that always happens is when a new generation with different ideals or different beliefs on what should be done comes in and creates change.
We're always thinking about stuff like that.
Every issue that America has, the youth should have some type of input on it because we are the ones who will see the consequences and the repercussions, whether good or bad.
This was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is it important? Why are we even talking about this now? It's ancient history.
Because America has never dealt with the issue of race in America.
We're in a climate today that I think is much worse than we were 50 years ago.
You know, racism has kind of grown up. Put a suit and tie on.
We have a serious problem in that people believe that it's all over, and that inhibits us from making it better.
How do we make it better?
Well, we make it better by people recognizing, first of all, that this is not nirvana, that we have not reached perfection on the issue of race.
In many ways, we are still divided.
Mostly white Americans see the 60s as a time of decline for the United States, when we lost our way, when people became disrespectful of law and order and lost a certain amount of patriotism. But by and large, African Americans see the 60s as a very redemptive time.
Black people, in fact, had been amazingly patient. How they kept it under control in that era is hard to figure out.
In the 5 decades since the 1968 riot, some things have changed dramatically.
People in Kansas City really ought to feel pretty good about things they've done. We had a fire chief, a police chief, we had black superintendents, we've had a black chair of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, and it goes on and on and on.
Recent protests in Kansas City have all stayed peaceful.
Fortunately, we've got a police department that's been pretty good about protests and how they've responded.
But in other areas, there's still room to improve.
Some of the same issues that we faced in 1968 that were the crux of the rioting around this nation, to a degree, still exist in urban America today.
We got to think about economic development. We have to think about education, and we have to think about housing.
But I also think that on the governmental level, we have to enact policies and recognize that there are differences and that some things have been done in order to perpetuate a bad system, and we have to create policies that address those issues.
Then, lean in to people who are different than you.
Just because we're black doesn't mean that we know everything about the tensions between black and white. We have to be willing to learn.
50 years later, do you look back at 1968 and say that it was worth it?
Oh, sure, it was worth it.
Oh, heck yeah.
It was worth it and it wasn't worth it because, again, to this day, that it has not come back.
I don't advocate riots and confrontation, but it does raise the consciousness.
KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
I think it succeeded in that. I mean, there was a certain renewed commitment to these problems that obviously shaped a lot of people's lives.
If you knew in 1968 what you know now about that riot, when they called you out of this church, what would you have told those kids?
Let's go to City Hall.
What started as a story about a student protest became the story of Kansas City and really our nation. One group blind to the needs of another and chaos because of it. 50 years later, we're having the same debates and the same problems in our communities. It's been over 18,000 days since April 9th, 1968. Let's not waste one more, allowing our differences to divide us. I'm Dia Wall. Thanks to Kansas City Public Television for collaborating with us on this project, as well as the UMKC LaBuddy Collection and the Kansas City Public Library. And thank you for watching 68, the Kansas City race riots then and now.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello, I'm Nick Haynes. Did we learn the lessons of the riots of 1968? The rioters spoke loudly. Were they heard? In August of last year, Dia Wall, reporter and anchor of Channel 41, emailed me and said, Nick, would KCPT be willing to partner with Channel 41 in telling the story of the Kansas City riots? Dia Wall, by the way, is right here in the front, the person who was the brainchild for the project. The biggest surprise for you in doing this project, Dia, was what?
How many of the issues that were the cause of the riots, according to this report that was issued in 1968, we're still talking about today, 50 years later?
We are going to be taking questions from our audience tonight because we really want to engage you in this conversation. But we have others who you saw in the film who we're engaging tonight. Congressman Emanuel Cleaver moved to Kansas City in 1968. A decade later, he would be elected to the city council, and 2 decades later, became the city's first black mayor. Our current mayor, Sly James, was coming home from an after-school job 50 years ago when the riots began. At a National Guard checkpoint, he was forced out of his car and onto the pavement. Former city councilman and the founder of Ad Hoc Group Against Crime, Alvin Brooks, was a Kansas City school district administrator when the riots broke out. He was one of the many civil rights and religious leaders who joined the student protest and marched with them to the steps of City Hall. Clarence Gibson was a fresh-faced police officer back then. He had a point-blank perspective on what was happening as he stood on the police line wearing a gas mask as tear gas flew. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Gibson. In 1968, Linda Spence felt the tear gas as a student at Central High School, which helped lead the student walkout. And Dr. Joel Rhodes is a Southeast Missouri State University historian who has conducted some of the most extensive research into this violent chapter in our local history. Thank you all for being with us. Now, we were told in the film that there were hundreds of disturbances all across the country. That is true. But few, Joel Rhodes, were as violent and with as many injuries as Kansas City.
There are more riots in the United States in the immediate days after King's assassination than in the entire year of 1967 combined. And aside from Washington, D.C. and Chicago, Kansas City's was as deadly and as volatile as any in the country.
Now, we'd like to say that there was no effort in Kansas City to allow people, the students, to memorialize Dr. King on his funeral on April 9th. But there was an effort to do so. There was a 1-minute observance, Sly James, in Kansas City schools that they permitted. That wasn't considered sufficient?
No, it wasn't sufficient because it didn't come close to capturing the gravity of the situation or the loss. It was tokenism in its earliest form.
50 years on, Emmanuel Cleaver, have we learned the lessons of the 1968 riots?
No. I was in Ferguson on the second day, and it looked like tanks were rolling down a street in Iraq, one of the Iraqi cities, and it was difficult to believe that this was a little town of 20,000 people and troops from all over. It was one of the most intimidating things that most people in that the generation that was out on the streets had ever seen. They knew nothing about the riots.
You say in the film, Mayor Sly James, if you don't address the concerns of disaffected people, you're going to have a riot. But 50 years have taken place. We haven't had a riot like this before. Have we never risen to that level of disaffection again in Kansas City?
I don't know if I'd say we haven't risen to the level of disaffection, but I don't know that we've had the sparks to light the powder keg. The death of Martin Luther King was a seminal event, and it was something that charged the already latent anger and made it very active. I can't say that we've had the same type of atmosphere that would charge it, but I don't necessarily think that that means that all is good. Schools are still in the shape that they're in terms of their segregated nature. Jobs are still harder to come by. Neighborhoods are still suffering. So I can't tell you that it won't happen again. But the problem is that this country is not equipped politically to deal with the chronic problems of the country. In order to deal with chronic issues, you have to have sustainability and sustainable solutions. We don't have them.
It's easy to look back and recoil with horror at these scenes, but Clarence Gibson, who just, by the way, just retired this month from the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, the last remaining police officer who was there during the riot of 1968. But you say, quote, you can't judge those officers in 1968 by today's standards. What was different?
We were dealing with guys who were in World War II, whose mindset was a lot different than guys my age at the time who had just come back from Vietnam. And there were old timers out there, and I mean, there was anger among them, you know, more so than a lot of the young guys. But I just think it had to do with their backgrounds more than anything else.
We had an email from a police officer who was there too, now living in the Ozarks. His name is Jim, and he writes, quote, rioters made the mistake of confronting our lines, which were full of returned Vietnam vets, and we were commanded by World War II veteran officers. They picked the wrong generation to try and screw over, so we kicked some butt. Leadership
matters. Fast forward to 1992. After Rodney King, the officers in the Rodney King beating were acquitted, about 400 people gathered on Brush Creek. And she may even be here tonight, but Carol Coe called me in the mayor's office and said, there's a large crowd gathering. There are about 400 people, and they're still coming. We're getting ready to march to the plaza. And she said, you need to get out here. And so the police officer drove me out. The difference in what happened with Mayor Davis and the response from the police chief at the time, Clarence Kelly, Steve Bishop and I were on the phone and talking about the fact that we should not have any police going out there. We didn't need the helicopter flying above, and he agreed. And that was step one in preventing something from happening, because if police had come out, we wouldn't have a problem.
We also view this as a very specific area of Kansas City that was affected by this. We note, going through the historic record, that during the riot over the state line, Johnson County officials declare a state of emergency. What were they afraid was going to happen, historian Joe Rhodes?
Well, in fairness, when Mayor Davis asked for a state of emergency on the first night, he asked all the surrounding suburbs to follow suit, and Johnson County did that. The short answer is the plaza is the main concern, and when the first reinforcements of the National Guard are deployed, they're deployed in the plaza. There is a concern that the riot will spill over into this district, and you could not travel into Johnson County without providing the police department proof that you live there or you were employed there.
Alvin Brooks.
One of the captains came out and told the businessmen at a meeting in the plaza, it was quoted in the Star, you don't worry, we've got them contained down there. The same thing at 31st and Truce. That same captain made the statement to the businessmen around 31st and Truce, don't worry about it, we have them contained down there. That was a mentality that not only Kansas City was just a microcosm of what America was all about.
You say in the film, Congressman Cleaver, that people didn't want to, if they went west of Truce, that was death.
Absolutely. As long as they stayed in the Negro neighborhoods, things were okay. I mean, even if they were looting or burning. But it was crossing that Mason-Dixon line and getting close to the plaza. And that was the thing that I was afraid of back decades later. And I'm not sure that it's changed dramatically differently.
Did any positive change occur as a result of these riots? Did the riots actually make any conditions better?
I'm not sure how they would have made the conditions better when those conditions remain the same. The conditions that led to the riots still exist today. Those conditions won't change until we have the ability to engage in sustainable addresses of the problems that are there. The war on poverty was an abject failure, like the war on drugs. And we ought to stop going to war with it and start finding a way to collaborate with it and fix it.
Alvin Brooks.
One thing did happen. Public accommodation was passed. I am convinced that in April of 1968, if it had not been for the riot, the white community would not have passed the ordinance. When that referendum came, they would have voted against it. That was one thing. Yeah, I'm convinced. The kids are responsible for the passage of the emergency measure establishing fair housing in Kansas City.
The Mayor's Commission report comes out with more than 40 recommendations, a lot of them involving the police. There weren't enough police, is one recommendation. We need more. They were too underpaid. They need better pay. And they need to be far more representative of the community they serve. 7% of the police officers back in 1968 were African Americans, 7%. I did look today, we're at over 12% today. That is some progress. Linda, you're not too convinced. But that is progress. Mayor, you're on the police commission.
Yes. And?
Okay, so 7 to 12% wasn't a big enough impact for you?
No. No. The police department should look like the community it serves, which is one reason why when I hear the drumbeat of some of the officers wanting to be able to live outside of Kansas City and still police this city, I am so adamantly, completely, and irretrievably opposed to that. The way I look at it is very simple. If you can't live in the city, you can't police the city. So And I don't want to make this a beat on the police situation, because there are a lot of police officers in this city who try very hard to do the right thing. The problem is that we still lag behind on basic understandings about people. There has to be a connection between the community and the police. And right now, it's better, but it is not fixed.
Clarence Gibson.
I agree with him 100%. We have footbeat officers downtown in the businesses. And I've argued, why don't we put footbeat officers in the community, communicate with the community, and build up a relationship?
What was the response to that when you were saying that?
But I remember when they had a model cities program, we had something called a pinpoint patrol. And I volunteered for that. We walked 2-man foot beats over on the west side, and I did a year over on 31st and Prospect area. We had what they call discretionary enforcement. We could handle things without taking them to jail. But the whole idea was most people do not deal with the police unless they've been arrested, getting a ticket, some distraught situation, somebody's died or something like that. As a footbeat officer, you're going into doors to each of the businesses, you're talking to people, you know people. I don't know how many times on the west side, hey, Gibson, Campbell, having tacos, come on in, you know. But we were we were their cops, in their mind. We were their cops. We weren't the other cops.
Even though the goals that you would like to see happen haven't taken place, did, though, the 1968 riots improve the nature of policing in Kansas City?
No, I think that's fairly clear here. And there is a testimony in the Mayor's Commission that didn't make it into that report that I think speaks to this perfectly. It said until J.C. Nichols advertises in the Kansas City Call, nothing is going to change.
We also want to hear from you, and Dia Wall will be taking your questions, and she'll have a mic over here, and you can come to her, and she will engage you in pithy, not huge, long political statements, but if you can have great questions in about 20, 30 seconds or so. Linda Spence.
I want to just dovetail on what they've been saying about, police becoming better or whatever, because recently in the state of Missouri, we've passed a law that a police officer doesn't have to be any further than high school. Okay? Now, that's not good.
I think the report addressed that the police weren't paid enough.
Federal government has a responsibility. When I was during my term as mayor, we were able to get community policing grants. But the problem with the community policing grants is that the government would do it for, I can't remember now, 3 or 4 years, and then the local department would have to assume the full cost. Most police stations in the United States can't do that. And so if the federal government is going to bail out of everything, we're going to have major problems, and that's exactly what we're seeing.
Okay. All righty. I have lots more questions, but I want to hear from Dia Wall, who has lots of questions from you.
This is Steve Patton. My question is, was regular troops seriously considered or put on alert for deployment into Kansas City? Does anybody know that?
No, I was
We
saying, not to my
had, though, there was
understanding.
over 1,000 National Guardsmen here, though.
There were, and some of the units came from Carthage and Joplin, which is an interesting dynamic to bring white troops from the Ozarks into Kansas City.
Jeff Lewis.
I wondered if you all have been uplifted recently by the movements of the young people, particularly high school and college age people, not just in Florida, but also all around the country.
Having been a student at that time, I feel their pain. And yes, I'm very uplifted. I posted something on Facebook. I told them, keep going, and I'll follow.
When I asked, were there any benefits in the long run, you said very little progress had been made. So does that take away from the value of protest?
I don't want anybody to get the impression that we're saying that there's been no progress. I mean, the fact that Brooks, James Cleaver sitting up here is a very clear sign that we've had progress. There's no question about it.
I'm going to roll in 2 questions that we got from Facebook since we're streaming. So what's up to our online and social media audience? Aaron from Facebook Live wants to know, how much does community policing cost? And Robert wants to know, what's the legal alternative to violent protest and how to best go about it?
community policing means you have to take police officers out of the car. We have 318 square miles. If we put a large contingency of officers walking, a lot of that miles is not going to be covered. So but I'm saying that community policing means a lot more police officers than we have with 1,400.
How do you feel about a larger police budget to accommodate that, Mayor James?
Every year I've been in office, that police budget has gone up. We are obligated under state law to give 20% of our general fund. We're closer to 40, 41, 42%. So there's money. But I disagree that everything comes down to the number of officers. When I'm told that we need more officers, and my question is to do what? Because just putting people on there doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Do you agree with that, Clarence Gibson?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Pithy and insightful. Dear Wall.
Rebecca Davis.
We're saying that part of the cause of the riot had to do with the lack of commemoration and respect for Dr. King after his death. What is Kansas City planning on doing 50 years on for that same type of commemoration?
The ugly side of that is that we've been struggling in Kansas City for the last year, a little over a year, trying to get a Martin Luther King street or boulevard or road. We're the only city in the United States, over 12,000, that doesn't have a street named Martin Luther King.
But back to the whole issue of commemorating. In the film, we saw the names of the 6 people who died, but there's nowhere in Kansas City that in any way honors and remembers that period in our history.
To answer your question, there's no central location where any recognition was given to those 6 persons who were murdered during the riots of '68.
It's been said, too, that there are parts of Kansas City, Missouri that have never been improved upon since 1968. Really?
You can drive down 31st Street today. I mean, there are signs still very present, Prospect, that would speak very eloquently to the fact that scars remain. The fires have gone out, but the scars remain.
Well, I was just saying, and to answer Dia's question, I think the Facebook question about is there an alternative to this? Well, that's the million-dollar question, because you can change foreign policy into war, you can pass legislation to change our gun laws, but how do you deal with white flight? How do you deal with underemployment, unemployment, segregated schools? These are beyond legislation.
We're near the end of our show. This is the last. We don't have enough time to finish this, but you heard some of the questions, the back and forth in terms of what had happened and how things are, and we haven't made a whole lot of progress. It's more than just adding new police. It's more than defunding the police, and you can't defund the police. The problem is the system and the training of these officers, and to make sure. And also, I think was at the mayor that you have a point that you're better off getting police officers that live within the district and not in the suburbs, not in your white blight suburbs. Do you want to add police officers? You want people that care and people have a stake in what happened. Now, like I said, well, we worked hard in Harrisburg back in the '60s to prevent a major riot. I myself communicated with the mayor back in those days and told him not to put police officers or not to overreact to this whole situation. And the result of that, we did not have a riot. We had hundreds of students that marched, and we didn't have one incident in that march. Later on, we had some small occurrences, but nothing that happened in other communities. Hey, we just wanted to present that to you, because sometimes you got to take a look back at history in order to move forward and try to make sure that history does not repeat itself. By the way, hey, we're still down at Saturdays, no, excuse me, still down at 11 Farmers Market in the city of Lebanon, 35 South 8th Street. We're there. Come down to see us. We have statues. We have oils. We have African clothing. We have a whole large accommodation of things that are happening, and we have a food court. There's also just a lot of things at that market, in addition to African paradise that you can see and you can do. Really appreciate you tuning in and bearing with us. We had a few little technical difficulties early, but we were able to work them out with the help of my lovely wife. I want to thank Mr. Chris Thomas for his engineering skills and ability, and also just the fact that he created this platform that we can use to promote things that are good. Well, we want to know that we love you here, and we will continue to broadcast positive things that will make positive change. Until we see again, until we meet again, God bless you, so long, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.